The Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by High Stick NT, Cruiser Max Vibrance Beans, and Pride Seeds.
So Horst, in your presentation today, you talked about an opportunity for growers to step up and take advantage of those high prices that are there now and some of the things that growers can do. Let's talk about the first topic, row width.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it is an exciting time in the soybean world, and largely that's because of prices, of course. And so when there's a little more money on the table, we can afford to play with some more ideas. As a general statement, we still are convinced that narrow rows are the way to go. But interestingly enough, the more research we do, and maybe it's because we're planting a little earlier, maybe it's because we are planting different varieties and the breeding is done more in wider rows. Maybe it's because we have a few more heat units. We seem to be getting away with planting wider rows and still achieving pretty nice yields. So what I'm trying to say is, where we are today is we would still encourage growers to do the best job to establish the right number of plants per acre. And generally, narrow rows are the way to go. But, there's a lot of guys making wide rows work as well. And we need a little more research on that. When it comes to a lot of extra inputs, maybe wider rows are a little more practical to try and hit those beans with some extra fertilizer or whatever, right?
Speaking of fertilizer, you talked about, a lot of growers are spending a lot of work trying to get fertilizer placed.
Right.
But you said, we're not doing a bad job, and, even broadcasting is not a bad way to go.
Well, the key point to remember is that just by putting on extra fertilizer does not mean that you're going to get extra yield. It's simply not the case. And the reason for that is you're not really addressing the fundamental yield issue. In other words, if the plant has enough NPK, whatever nutrient we're talking about, putting on extra isn't going to give you anything extra. And we have this attitude sometimes that, if I throw on lots, we'll get extra yield. Okay, so that's one part of it. And the other part is, we know that with other crops, if we try and get that fertilizer closer to the root zone, banding, right in furrow, liquid, there's a bit of a pop there, and that makes sense, right? The nutrient is closer to the root zone, easier to be taken up by the plant. Well, we've tried a lot of that in soybeans, and it just does not provide extra yield from what we've seen so far. Why is that? It's because yield is established late in the season, and by that time the roots are big. So what I'm getting at is, when you put on starters or whatever, the plant often looks better in the spring. You get all excited, you get the combine in, it's the same yield as putting on just a broadcast treatment, if you need any fertilizer. So my recommendation is still, and no one has been able to show me any different, and we've done a lot of trials over 10 years, broadcasting, if your soil test is slipping, seems to work just as well as banding or any other form of application.
Let's talk a little bit about tillage. Your message there, one of them, was really about, let's make sure we got a little tillage to make sure that drill is working well.
Right. So what we're trying to hit on there is, when you really try and assess what are you doing with tillage, right? We're not out there playing games. We're trying to do something. And what we're trying to do in soybeans seems to be establishing the right number of plants. So what I'm trying to get at is, just because you've done tillage does not mean that you're actually increasing yield. Often it's just that you have established more plants per acre, and maybe because of that you're actually increasing your yield a little bit. So maybe another way to look at it is, if I can establish enough plants, maybe I need less tillage. So I'm not a big fan of deep tillage, of excessive tillage, because there's a lot of erosion issues, soil degradation. And when you look at the actual research, we don't need that tillage to produce a good crop of soybeans. We have had plots of over 90 bushels straight no-till. Hard to believe, but it does work. if you do it right. That's the key, if you do it right.
What about pushing populations? Economically, can you do it at these prices?
Yeah, so the long and the short of it is the response curve. In other words, how much of a response do I get to more plants per acre? It does kind of top out once you get closer to 200, and it's pretty much at the absolute top end in our research at 250. So what can you afford to put on as you sell beans for more? You can afford to put on a little more. The problem with that is if you're buying the very best genetics, they also want more today. So, you know, it's almost kind of comical when we crunch the numbers. We're right back to where we were again in terms of our recommendation of about 177 in 15-inch rows and 194 in 7.5-inch rows, right? So even though you should be putting on a little higher seeding rate to get the most yield, because the seed is also a little more expensive, we're right back to where we started.
And finally, does early planting have to be part of this equation?
Yeah, early planting. So, you know, there is no question that on average early planting provides some more yield. Too early is not good either. Planting the wrong variety too early is also no good. And the reason for that is you sometimes miss out on those nice showers in later August or even September. You got to remember that August and September are pretty important for soybeans. So if you plant too early and the bean finishes too early, you can miss out on some of the growing season. So early, yes. Ultra early, no. And what does that mean for Ontario? Well, it depends where you are, but generally the last week of April is early enough. And there's nothing wrong with the first part of May.
Good stuff. Thanks for taking the time today.
Appreciate the invitation.